Hey, Life Science. So we're going to do things a little differently this time, and for a couple reasons, so let me explain before we get started. First, when we all went remote, that was a surprise to everybody. And because the whole year, school was just going normally, as soon as it went remote, everybody just had to know how to do it right away, just go, no no master plan for everybody. It was just everybody figure out how to do it, make it happen, get it done. And so far, it's been pretty good. I think that we've had a whole bunch of different ways of getting it right, and that's great. But you know that sometimes your first try, even if it is good, doesn't have to be the very best. You can find ways to do things differently. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not. It's all very complicated, which means that I like to do a lot of experimentation. See what works, see what doesn't work, figure out why it doesn't work. And it's good for me because, something might be very difficult for me to do and you guys don't care and there's no point for me to keep doing it. Or maybe somebody else is trying to figure out something, and if I can try it for myself, maybe I can give them some advice. So here we are doing another experiment, another phase of what it might look like to do remote education. So rather than having the notes built into the presentation, I'm going to have the notes aside, and that's something that you'd fill in as you're doing this lesson. I think this might streamline the process. If it turns out to be just a huge, oh no, this is terrible, then of course I will not do this anymore. But gotta try it, gotta see what it's like to do it, and see what it's like for me and for you. Without any further ado, let's get started. We are doing animals. We did some marine invertebrates. We did Phylum Porifera and Phylum Cnidaria before. Now we're going to get started with invertebrates. That would be animals that lack a vertebrate, animals that lack a backbone. And we're going to do Phylum Annelida. Those are the segmented worms. So you are going to have to know some terms specifically dealing with body sides, because when I describe the body parts of a more complex animal, I need to be able to tell you what part of the animal it's in. So here's a couple terms to have in mind. First two are anterior and posterior. You might even know these names. Anterior refers to the end of an animal that contains its head, and the hole on that side of the animal is its mouth. That's where food goes in. You're probably also going to find eyes over there, a nose if it has it, probably ears if the animal has those. That's where the head of the animal is. The posterior end is the end of an animal that contains its tail, and that's where the, let's say, opposite of a mouth is. Food goes in the anterior end. After digestion, it goes out the posterior end. Usually for animals, that would be the front and the back. For us, though, since we stand upright, our anterior end is actually kind of on the top, whereas our posterior is, actually kind of in the middle, because, it's at the top of our legs and the bottom of our belly, and I shouldn't have to keep describing where that is. I'm going to move on. So the dorsal side of an animal is the top, that is, if it's in the ordinary orientation of animals. But we also kind of refer to that as the back of the animal, because in vertebrates, that's where the backbone is. And for us who stand upright, that actually is our back. When you ride on a horse's back, you're riding on the top of a horse. The ventral side would be the side of an animal that is on the bottom, and that would be like its belly. That would be the side opposite the dorsal. For us, that's actually like the front. That's where our belly is. It's on the front. But you know that a dog would have to roll over for you to be able to rub its belly, its ventral side. Okay, so the next time you're petting a dog and it rolls over and lets you pat its belly, you can be all nerdy and be like, "Oh, who's a good boy? Can I rub your ventral side?" And everybody's just going to look at you like a weirdo. Let's move on. So we are going to go with the common earthworm as an example of phylum Annelida. The earthworm belongs to genus Lumbricus. They have bilateral symmetry, which again means that if you wanted to cut one in half, you'd have to have it in just the right orientation to have mirror left and right sides. But, don't do that. That's mean. There is a recognizable feature on their body. It's called the clitellum, and it is that light-colored band that is recognizable on earthworms. It's actually part of their reproductive system, and it's on their anterior side. We will talk about how they reproduce later, but first, let's talk about how they move. They have two muscle layers that work in tandem, a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. Now, the way it works is they contract and flex, and that changes the shape of the worm. When the circular layer contracts, the worm is long and thin, but when the longitudinal layer contracts, the worm is short and thick. So by stretching out and compressing in, it's able to inch along, and it doesn't just squirm in place because it has setae, which are small anchoring bristles that keep it in place so that it can, kind of like get a hold of the soil where it is and then contract past it. How do they eat? So there's 3 stations in their head, or I should say on their anterior end, that are the first stops in their digestion. So it brings soil into its pharynx. That would be well, tell you what, your mouth is an opening, but what about inside? We use the word mouth kind of loosely. Turns out that the mouth is just an opening. Think of it like the door. Your mouth is the door. What's the room inside? What's the name of the place where your tongue is? We would say that's in your mouth, but in fact, you can't be in a door. You go through a door. The inside of your mouth is actually your pharynx. That's what a pharynx is. It's the opening, it's the space past the opening that is your mouth. It's where you can have air and food before you swallow or inhale. Right, so the earthworm ingests soil by sucking it into the pharynx. Okay, there's some soil, and then it stores it in what's called a crop, and then passes it to a gizzard. Those are just a couple little stations along the way. Now, to digest it, it actually just kind of grinds it with muscular contractions, kind of like squeezing its insides to mush the soil into smaller pieces. It's not actually trying to eat the dirt. It's looking for the vegetation and decayed organic matter that's in the dirt. So after it's been all like mushed up and stuff, it passes through the intestines all the way out the posterior end, out the anus. And in the digestion, in the intestines, it's digested with enzymes, which are just biological chemicals that its body makes. Just like you make stomach acid, it makes these enzymes. And the food that it's looking for ends up getting dissolved and absorbed into its blood, and then the blood shares it to the rest of the body. Now, when it comes to waste, the soil that passes through the intestines and out the anus isn't necessarily waste so much as uneaten food. It's the soil that was passed along that didn't get that has all the food removed from it. When the earthworm's cells actually consume that food and use it up, they produce waste, and that gets collected in something kind of like kidneys. It's nephridia, and then it's excreted through nephridiopores. Okay, so that is the digestion of an earthworm. Good for earthworms, right? Well, actually turns out kind of good for a lot of things because earthworms contribute to their environment by aerating soil, which basically means that they add air spaces to the soil, which is really beneficial because it means that the roots have a little bit of air that they're exposed to. It's necessary to do that because then um, they can absorb water that is filling that space, but also they can absorb oxygen from whatever air is in those spaces. Something else they do, since they're always moving around and redistributing soil, they can actually transport some organic matter down deeper. This is a picture of what's called a soil horizon. It's dark up at the top because that's where all the compost is. That's where all the dead grass has decomposed. Lots of organic stuff up there. It's really light down around B. Not a lot of organic stuff down there. Earthworms can transport some down there. Okay, so let's see what else we've got here. There's circulatory system. Earthworms have no heart, which I'm really sorry to say. If you love an earthworm, it has no heart. Instead, it has two main blood vessels: a dorsal blood vessel, remember, on its dorsal side, and a ventral blood vessel, obviously on its ventral side. So if it doesn't have a heart, how does it get its blood throughout its body? It has these special blood vessels called aortic arches. And it turns out that these aortic arches are lined with muscle. In other words, the blood vessels themselves kind of squeeze blood through. Almost reminds me of like how you would get ketchup out of a ketchup packet, except obviously it's not from outside, it's the muscle itself contracting. So the blood goes out through the ventral blood vessel. That's the one on its belly, so to speak, and it returns through the dorsal blood vessel. That would be the one on its back. Okay, how about its respiratory system? So they don't have lungs, they breathe through their skin. And the gases exchange through its epidermis, helped out by a moist layer called a cuticle. So if you were to go down into your lungs, you'd find a space where there's an air pocket right next to your blood vessels. And that's where the oxygen enters your blood, way down deep in your lungs. That is not how it works for earthworms. That gas exchange happens right on their skin, which means that their skin is very sensitive. Their skin is basically like the inside of our lungs. By the way, this is why it's so easy for earthworms to drown and why you might find so many of them out on the pavement, whether it be sidewalk, road, or driveway, after it rains. Because when it rains, the pore spaces in the soil fill up with water. Earthworms can't breathe, can't hold their breath because they just absorb oxygen through their skin, so they need to escape and get out so that they don't drown in the ground. Nervous system. So earthworms don't have a brain. They don't have a central nervous system like we do, where there's just like one big control center that's connected to the rest of the body through nerves. Instead, their nervous system is distributed throughout their body. It has what are called ganglia. Ganglia are kind of like brain juniors. They are just small collections of nerve cells rather than our enormous central one, our brain. And then those ganglia are connected to the rest of the body through a large ventral nerve cord. And there's a small ganglion in each segment, which basically means that there's a brain junior, a tiny brain. It's really not fair using the word brain. It has nervous system spread throughout its body rather than centralized in its head and then connected. Okay, now let's talk about how earthworms reproduced. We mentioned the clitellum earlier, and it's going to come into play here. Do you remember perfect flowers that have both a carpel and stamens? So earthworms are kind of like that. The term for that is called hermaphroditic, where they possess both the male and female reproductive organs. Now, unlike perfect flowers, they can't mate with themselves. They still need another earthworm in order to reproduce. They keep their sperm in one place, they keep their eggs in another place, and then what ends up happening is two earthworms are going to join together by forming a cocoon around their clitellum. So they have to line themselves up so that where they keep their sperm cells in the seminal vesicle is lined up with the other earthworms. What was that called? Oviduct? Yeah, oviduct. There we go. I lost it. Anyway, so what happens is they form a cocoon around the clitellum. I'm picturing in my head almost like a trick-or-treat bag, which I know is weird, but go with me on this. So the earthworm basically backs out of it and drops off the eggs and the sperm into it. So it's almost like an egg case. So once the worm is out of the cocoon, then it's sealed up. You got fertilized eggs in there, and then they just have to develop until they can be little baby worms. Well, we spent a lot of time on Phylum Annelida. Let's talk about some other segmented worms. We can't talk about annelids the entire time. How about leeches? So leeches are super duper gross. On the left is a picture of a leech feeding. Yuck. So it's got its head, I want to say buried, but that makes it sound like it's inside. No, it's just got a flat face. It's pressed against that skin, and it's nomming. It's eating, and it's doing so by just scraping the surface enough to get some blood out. And while that's horrifying and gross and nightmare and yuck and gross and turns out that was actually a common medical practice. Doctors would keep leeches on hand, and they could apparently make you better by getting the bad blood out of you. That's obviously incorrect, but hey, like that's the state of medicine for a while. Aren't you glad to be alive now? So there is another class of segmented worms. These are called Polychaeta. So any worm that belongs to this group is called a polychaete. These look absolutely amazing, and they live underwater. So one particular kind is called a feather duster worm. Like I said, it lives in the ocean, marine environment, and it constructs a tube that it lives in. And it has these tentacles that stick out of the tube that are covered in cilia and mucus, tiny little hairs. So almost think of it like a brush coated in glue. And so what'll happen is algae or food will just get stuck in it, and then the cilia pass it down into the mouth. So it's like it's got a big net out there just for catching stuff to eat. That's the feather duster worm. We've also got, I kid you not, the Christmas tree worm. Again, lives in the ocean, builds a tube to live in, and it's got this amazing shape. Its tentacles are arranged in this like spiral whirl shape called radioles. And so it's got this shape that kind of makes it look like a Christmas tree. Absolutely crazy, but hey, like that's invertebrates for you. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. We talked about annelids, polychaetes, leeches, and we learned about how their body structure, as different as it is from ours, still uses some of the same terminology because at the end of the day, all animals share a lot in common. All right, well, that's all for now.